to our series on environmental management systems. Today is February 26, 2013, and we'll be learning about EMS auditing. This is the second part in the series that we hosted on environmental management systems auditing. And we're pleased to bring this series to you in partnership with the Washington State Department of Ecology, the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable, the Stewardship Action Council, and the Auditing Roundtable. Just a few ground rules for folks. Folks are on mute, so if you do have questions during the webinar today, please use the chat feature to type in your question, and we'll address those periodically through the webinar today. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be putting those up on YouTube for folks to view in the future, or go back and there's a link to our website which has the PowerPoint presentations available as well. So again, it's a pleasure to introduce this topic today. Why don't we go ahead to the first slide, Angela? I just wanted to provide an overview of this series. I believe this is the sixth in the series that we started last year. This is just a quick summary of the overall series. We did an introduction last fall. Next slide. Then we talked about it moving more into implementation in terms of measurement and monitoring, engaging employees, communities, in terms of the programs that folks are putting in place. Next slide. And then we've concluded with the auditing session, and this is being conducted by Dennis Sasseville today. He's also a member of the Auditing Roundtable, which is an organization dedicated to environmental performance monitoring and auditing. Next slide. So I do this usually at the first of every presentation just to remind folks that here in Washington State, we do have an EMS alternative that allows folks to produce that in lieu of a traditional pollution prevention plan. And this just references where those are in the rules in RCW. Next slide. There is basically a process to get started. We encourage you to work with our regional staff at the earliest opportunity. We have 4 regional offices throughout the state with toxics reduction specialists that will work with you to support your EMS development or enhance your EMS, provide that sounding board for being as effective as you can with your systems at your facility. There's a process basically to request getting into the system, into the program, and there's some documentation that we would review before coming out to do a site visit. Next slide. And so again, there is a site visit to come out and support a review of the EMS, get a picture of where you are in the process. Our program does require a periodic assessment, and this is a requirement at least once every 5 years, although we recommend annual check-ins or a 3-year audit is a typical for the industry. And then we do have an annual progress report requirement to track progress as part of your EMS, and that can be submitted as part of your Turbo Plan online web system that we support, or email supporting materials. Next slide. And here are the 3 primary criteria that we're looking at in terms of reviewing EMS, in terms of having a strong pollution prevention policy in place, focused on, again, implementation, and then how you go about monitoring and measuring results. Next slide. This is just an example of a self-assessment checklist, and this is available on the website. Is a way to help step you through the process and coordinate with your regional P2 specialist. Next slide. This is the second page. It allows you to identify how you go about setting your objectives and targets, roles and responsibilities, training, the periodic assessment, and then the annual progress report. Next slide. So before we get started, we want to do a quick interactive poll with folks. So today's question is, does your organization value EMS audits in the spirit of continuous improvement? Take a look at that. In terms of yes, sometimes, no, or we don't have an EMS yet. Go ahead and click on that. And we will see the results here. Well, good. Looks like a spread here that folks see the value in the EMS, sometimes not. And then we have quite a large group that doesn't currently have maybe a formal EMS at this point. All right, thank you, Angela. So let's move on to our main presentation. I wanted to introduce Dennis Sasseville. He has over 35 years of experience in environmental management systems development, and has been certified on quite a few management systems, EMS, Occupational Health and Safety series. He's an EMS Lead Auditor and active in the National Auditing Roundtable. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dennis, and he'll take us through the remainder of the presentation. Again, remember, if you do have questions, put those in the chat box, and we'll get to those periodically.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate the introduction, and appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, those of you especially who partook of Part 1 last month as a continuation. Next slide, please. But we'll be sort of continuing the same theme of this two-part audit series, looking at management system auditing, and especially in light of how can it help drive environmental sustainability improvements. So some of the themes that we've woven throughout these Part 1 and Part 2 you see here in bulleted form. Certainly, as with any auditing, part of the purpose is you're looking to see whether or not the EMS is functioning well and providing the very performance improvements and goal attainment that you intend, that your organization intends. All right, next. So last month in Part 1, we really much covered kind of the principles of management system auditing, how it differs from compliance auditing, regulatory compliance auditing. We talked a bit about EMS auditor qualifications, and then the nuts and bolts of auditing, setting up audits and conducting them. And then a bit about extracting value from the auditing program, and we will continue on with that here in Part 2, that theme. Next slide. So in this part, we're going to really be talking about developing the audit report. You've done the audit. You're wrapping things up. Maybe you're still on site. You're headed toward the audit report, the kind of the who, what, when, and why. We're going to talk a little bit about common findings in EMS audits. This could be quite a lengthy discussion, but I've just highlighted some of the common findings that the EMS auditors come across over the years, and how you as a practitioner can either use that information in your audits or in preparing for audits. And then talking about now that the audit's job is complete, is the auditor part of the follow-up, or are they now hands-off and someone else follows up with the corrective actions and further reporting? Two different trains of thought, and we'll discuss those. And then after the audit and audit report, preparing for and conducting a management review. How do you conduct a management review? What should go into it? And how do you add value, business value, and kind of the whole framework that you're presenting to management? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, next. So if you were with us for Part 1, this is the EMS Wheel of Fortune, as it were, with the 5 groupings or elements as laid out by the ISO 14001 standard. And we're talking about the last 2 elements, checking and corrective action, which is what monitoring, measurement, auditing comes under that, and then the management review. And as I said under Part 1 last month, oftentimes many organizations do a pretty decent job in the first 3 components of an EMS plan or EMS framework, but not always so good on the last 2. And yet these 2 are critical to really having a robust system that works for you, helps drive some of the goals that your organization wants, helps provide some of that value that we're always talking about. Okay? Next. So we're going to be talking about audit reporting and just launch into it. Next. So if you remember the diagram from part one here, we've gone through the first two boxes of the pre-visit, setting up the audit, conducting the actual audit, and now we're looking at the post-visit. The closing meeting has already occurred. We're pulling together our notes, and we're looking at what should we have for an audit report, what is entailed in producing an audit report. Next, please. J.P. Russell is a great quality manager, oftentimes writes for ASQ Quality Progress and other magazines that ASQ has. And just his quote that I pulled out here, formulating audit results is a skill that adds significant value. It's kind of the theme of what we'll call modern auditing. In other words, we've gone beyond just the checklist approaches, especially when you're talking about evaluating a management system. There's a bit more subjectivity at times, and there's an opportunity to do more than just sort of a rote checklist and add value. I'll say that we're not going to get into some of the details of the reports in terms of some of the sections that could be included. I'll refer you back to ISO 19011, which the latest version came out in 2011, as sort of the guide or the Bible for auditor, everything from auditor qualifications to conducting audits to reports. But we'll highlight some of those things here today. All right, next. So let's say you're still on site, or you've recently you've had an audit team conduct the audit, and you're either on site or recently removed back to your offices, but this assumes you're still on site. Certainly before you leave, as an auditor, as an audit team, it's good to be sure to follow up with the facility for any clarifications to fill any of those gaps that haven't been addressed. So it means looking over your audit notes, making sure that you've accomplished what the stated purpose of the audit is and that you've gotten the information needed. Certainly, as the case with compliance auditing, regulatory compliance auditing, even with management system auditing, there may be issues of needing to look at interpretations of the standards that you're auditing against. ISO 14001, responsible care, a hybrid type EMS standard, some of the state-driven ones such as in Washington State. So there may be some need for some further research, and a lot of times that can be done right on site. The point is to kind of bring the audit to a close is to make sure that you resolve whatever needs resolving, whatever that is. If there were unclear situations that you came across while conducting your management system audit, try to get those clarified before you leave the site. Certainly there are times when the client may have to send you material as a follow-on, but hopefully that's kept to a minimum. Also, if it's a large enough audit that you have an audit team or even just two auditors, that's an audit team, there might be divergent audit opinions on what was found or what was observed. If you have time, this is the time while you're still on site to try to get those resolved. Sometimes it might be have to do with an interpretation of the standard or a subtle interpretation of what's required or what the state program desires or what's common or what's best practices. Those kinds of discussions are important to have so that the audit team gets on the same page in terms of the audit findings, the audit observations, and then being able to report correctly on up to management. So closing out open issues is definitely part of the audit and a very important part as well. So don't shortchange that step. Next slide. So just in sort of a summary kind of picture in terms of writing audit findings, oftentimes you may be using a form or a template. The state of Washington, as Ken showed you with some of the checklist approaches with regard to the material that they have on their website. There's a lot of, obviously any ISO registrar has their own kind of checklist and reporting forms for audit reporting, and there's just a lot available on the internet for free. So if you don't have some guide that you're following, there's a lot out there that you can get and modify to your purpose at hand. But here's some of the input that would normally go into an audit summary sheet, an audit summary form, a way of organizing your information, in addition perhaps to the straight audit checklist. Oftentimes these forms have a bit more information. Many times you might set a priority level. That's obviously a common thing to do with regard to regulatory compliance auditing. You know, the things that have to be taken care of, the things that are secondary, the things that are maybe just best practices. That's sometimes done within a management system approach. It's really up to you and to the party that you're serving, or the leadership program that maybe you're conducting the audit for. All right, next. So let's take a look at the writing audit findings here for a minute, and some of the whys and wherefores that go into writing audit findings. It's a little bit of an art as well as a science. Each finding should provide sufficient detail so that people who aren't involved in the audit, who weren't there or present, reading the report later on, probably include your management or the company's management, can understand exactly what the issue was. So you want to write certainly clearly and concisely. Usually, typically, audit reports are written in the past tense. Remember, audits are always just a snapshot in time. They're a sampling and a snapshot in time. You hope to have them as comprehensive as possible, and you certainly want to design them to be representative of the organization and the management system that you're auditing against. But they are just a snapshot in time. You have to keep that in mind. So normally what you want to do, especially in writing up concise audit findings, is clearly state any non-conformity, and then follow that by providing support or details. You state the source, the issue, and provide the follow-up detail. As with any auditing, it's always this kind of broad, what was the condition expected versus what was the condition found. Condition expected meaning in a regulatory sense, what are the environmental health and safety regulations, what do they require? In the management system sense, it's of course what does ISO 14001 or responsible care or the components of the state program, what do they require, what did we find? That's the overall approach and philosophy, obviously, in writing up an audit report and then summarizing your conclusions. Okay, next. Most commonly, this can certainly vary, but most commonly you probably have about 4 categories of categorizing your findings, grouping or categorizing your findings: major nonconformance, minor nonconformance, opportunities for improvement, and positives. Major nonconformance, just as it sounds, would be part of the EMS system that just isn't been addressed or implemented at all. So you're auditing an EMS, and there's really no nonconformance corrective action process in place, or it's not being utilized at all. That would be a major nonconformance. Minor nonconformance, just as it implies, doesn't quite raise to a major, but several minor nonconformances, if covering the same area, the same component of a management system, say training, for instance, several minor nonconformances, even in different parts and locations of the organization, could in aggregate be considered a major nonconformance. There's some guidance out there on that, but many times each organization has their own operating definition of when a minor becomes a major. It's not usually a hard and fast line, but the concept is there, major and minor. Opportunities for improvement are just that. They are things that the auditors see, observe, find out through document review or interview. It could be done better, could be done to the degree that it would improve the organization and improve the management system. Some of these might be best practices that other industries or other organizations follow that could be brought into the company or the organization that you're conducting the audit for. So these are usually written up as opportunities for improvement in an ISO registrar type of sense. They are sort of suggestions, strong suggestions, but not mandatory. In other types of EMS opportunities, EMS auditing, they might just very well be seen as just as opportunities for improvement, sort of a best practice, pointing you in the direction of best practices. And then positives. These are always good to point out in reports. Every organization does certain things probably very well, even if they have just a immature EMS or not even a formal EMS. So as an auditor, as an audit team, it's always good to at least point out some of the positive things that you see, some things that that organization is doing well, and documenting those in the report. It's certainly a nice pat on the back, but it also sort of helps frame the findings in a good light in terms of the balance that you've seen at that organization. Next, please. So let's just take a look at some examples of writing audit findings to get a flavor of what it makes for a useful, helpful audit report, one that does add value to the organization and the whole process. Certainly, it almost goes without saying that being specific yet not overstating the facts is kind of an important characteristic. So a couple examples. One I've got here, the facility has had no environmental awareness. Much better to say that, to point out where the facility, the awareness training was seriously deficient by citing, a percentage, presumably comes from a document that you've reviewed. Obviously, if only 30% of employees on a site are aware of an environmental policy, something is amiss with regard to training. So be specific, be clear, so that the trail can be followed, so that the auditee can benefit certainly from the audit report, and as we'll see in a moment, management can also benefit. Next slide. In a similar vein, avoid generalities. Saying things like just the objectives and targets were incomplete isn't particularly helpful. And certainly if that's all you wrote in your audit report for that section, that finding, you'd come back a couple months later and wonder what even you were thinking at the time. So, an example of some language that would be more helpful in framing what the issue was and why it doesn't quite conform to what the standard requires, or what a normal EMS would require. Next, please. Again, continuing with avoiding generalities, example here with the awareness training, a good thing to kind of pick on, because it's been times one of the more difficult concepts to get across and to implement fully throughout your rank and file employees, especially in a large manufacturing setting, perhaps, or process industry setting. The example of an improved audit finding, 3 out of 6 maintenance technicians, you're citing something specific. You're citing the EMS procedure. Those of you out there who do regulatory compliance auditing are certainly used to being able to cite, chapter and verse. This is the very same concept. It seems logical, but many times EMS auditors will sort of slip into having findings that are vaguer than they need to be, and vaguer that are helpful. Okay, next. Obviously, as with any auditing, you want to avoid extreme or speculative language. The world will end as we know it type of language. That's really not very helpful. It's certainly an exaggeration. Save that for when you're talking to friends about the sequester or something like that. But in an audit report, it's really not very helpful. So it's sort of like Joe Friday and Dragnet. Just sort of state the facts, be professional, be helpful by stating exactly what the issue was, and not speculating or blowing it out of proportion. If it's a serious issue, it's certainly logical and part of your duty and responsibility to point out the serious issue. All we're saying here is, be careful and professional with your language, especially in the written reports. All right, next. Usually with auditing, we talk about auditing the process, not the people. So this is along that vein, in that you don't normally cite individuals in an audit report. It's better to be a little bit more obscure and talk about maintenance staff or wherever the offending issue was. Now, when you're auditing on site, it'll probably be quite apparent to the auditee, maybe because they've been standing with you when these people were interviewed, what the issue was, and that's fine. All we're saying is that you need to be careful about identifying individuals in the report, or things that could come back and these individuals could be blamed. Again, you want to sort of engender a feeling, especially on management's part, that they want to improve their system, not pick on individual employees and said, well, we would have had a better audit if you had done your job. There may be individual responsibility here, certainly, but in writing up an audit report, best to be judicious and sensible in terms of how you coach those findings. All right, next. Again, sort of accuracy, and this goes along with sort of the comments about generalities, citing chapter and verse, and exactly why a component of the standard was not met, what you found, why it was not met. It's not very helpful to just have a generalized statement and then nothing to follow up on. Okay, next. Yeah, in terms of there's sort of I would say that the auditors, like everyone else, sort of either are grouped by being splitters or lumpers, right? We either like to, some of us like to go on and excruciating detail about things. Others maybe are just a bit too much on the generalization side. Again, try to find that balance when you're writing the audit report. It's certainly permissible to do things such as aggregate findings, common findings from different parts of the organization, from different locations, from different business units even. There might be a systematic failing or weakness within that organization on training, for instance, and you see it in whatever department or whatever function area you go to. Then you write that up as a training issue and would cite the different locations. What you're looking to do is to make sure that the overall understanding of the management system that's under review is what you want to come across. So if aggregating issues and common trends is helpful, and you should be normally looking for trends, not just isolated incidents, that's certainly permissible to do. Again, it helps to be at least have specific citations in terms of the locations or the business unit, the organizational unit that you found some of these issues with that you as an auditor find don't conform to the standard, to the requirement. Okay, next. So, but you do need to be careful, in combining findings that reflect multiple issues or multiple areas. You can end up with a sort of a sentence or a phrase, as we have here, where there's at least 4 different management system issues sort of hidden in this statement about newly hired, untrained maintenance staff place unlabeled boxes of spent fluorescent bulbs in the landlord's dumpster on orders from the supervisor. There's issues of management and supervisors, so roles and responsibilities. There's issues of training. There's issues of newly hired people. Have they been given the proper training before they're allowed to launch into their job? There is perhaps regulatory issues, and that you're talking about unlabeled boxes of a universal waste. And then there's even sort of landlord-tenant issues in terms of you have permission to go even use the landlord's dumpster or to put some of these things in the landlord's dumpster, certainly not if it's illegal. So a statement like this on itself is not very helpful. Now you may have further explanation that plays off of this kind of statement where you do explain and sort of unpack what the issues were, and they're just using the statement as an example or a lead in to that part of the report. That's fine, but again, don't leave things unsaid. Always be thinking about someone reading this who wasn't on the audit, who maybe isn't even clear about why the EMS audit took place, a board member, a member of senior management. So be clear and don't overstate, and unpack these kinds of issues if needed be. All right, next. Yeah, above all, especially for the regulatory compliance auditors among us, keep in mind that you are reviewing a management system. You're looking for those kinds of, you're looking for conformance against the standard, ISO 14001 or the EMS standard that you're following. But you're also looking for the management system is a reflection of the whole organization. So you're looking for trends and practices and processes. You're looking for systemic issues, not micro non-compliance issues. Regulatory non-compliance may be a symptom of a larger issue. It oftentimes is in EMS auditing. All we're saying here is don't get hung up on putting on your compliance auditor hat and losing sight of the fact that you're doing a management system audit, and the value that you're providing at this point in time is a management system audit. Or if you have a mixed audit, both compliance and management system, even if it's the same team members. Be sure you separate out those issues. So specific non-conformances are certainly an important indication of the system, and it shouldn't be overlooked. But our point is here that don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. All right. So let's look at some common non-conformances that EMS auditors come across. These are the following are not necessarily statistical or through any statistical survey. They're more anecdotal information, or from my experience and other auditors that I've worked with, but they certainly are some commonalities that continue to arise. So whether you're certified to an ISO standard, or whether you just are reporting on to the state agencies, the P2 agencies, these are things that you want to be looking for as kind of common weaknesses or common issues that we find out there in EMS auditing. The first, with environmental policy, you want to avoid those broad sweeping statements in a policy. It's easy for management, especially, or the board of directors, to get carried away with a lot of arm waving and saying that you're the best this in the world or the best that in the world. Your policy really sets the tone for the rest of the EMS, as we said previously, and I think was probably emphasized in the previous webinars before we got to the point here of looking even at auditing. So you want the policy to be, it's fine if it's aspirational and a bit poetic or whatever, if that's your organization and that's a characteristic of the culture organization, that's okay. Just make sure that you haven't made statements that are so sweeping that it can't be supported. Also, if you're following a standard, you need to be careful of some of the language. 14,001 really doesn't look kindly when you say that you are striving for regulatory compliance. The standard asks you to commit to complying. Now, that doesn't mean you're in compliance 100% of the time. No one necessarily is. But a commitment, a management organizational commitment, is a lot different than just striving. So sometimes a policy's language will be a little bit too vague, a little bit too open-ended. Maybe some of the attorneys, corporate attorneys, got involved in helping to craft some of it. So oftentimes we see that to be the case, that the language could be tightened up. Also, even though you're following a standard such as ISO 14001 or something similar, most of the standards also require you to define whether you have other requirements the organization commits to. So again, in the chemical industry, if you're a member of responsible care, that's a definite EMS type requirement, or certainly has overlaps with your EMS system. If not actually being managed as a responsible care system. These other requirements typically would be an industry trade group type of thing, or perhaps if you're a single plant or part of a corporate group, is a corporate requirement or a corporate kind of code of conduct or corporate code of sustainability that you're following, in addition to the specifics of the EMS standard. Oftentimes the policy doesn't necessarily refer to these, even though when in fact the facility is following that other requirement. So something to be aware of. Under legal requirements, the comment is find that not all legal requirements are adequately identified. The organization takes its last compliance audit or takes a list of its permits and says this is all we need to do. That may or may not be true. So you need to look at all of your legal requirements, not just kind of the ones that are most front and prominent, based upon your actually permits in hand. And then updated procedures are not adequately maintained. It's fine that you do the legal requirement matrix or listing or registry at one point in time. It's a moving target. Regulations change, legal requirements change, and the expectation is if you have a robust management system that those things have been kept up to date. And oftentimes we find out that that can be a little bit lacking as systems out there. Okay? In the environmental aspects, the largest sort of issue that we come across as EMS auditors, I'd say, is that you want to see that the environmental aspects registry or listing is essentially viewed by the organization as an inventory of all environmental aspects and impacts that it has. And so many times certain things are not looked at as strongly as others or set off the table, perhaps energy or distribution or some facet of your organization that's not really included, housekeeping perhaps, groundskeeping, things such as that. So a complete aspect list is something that is important and that auditors do and should look for. Objectives and targets, sometimes you see that objectives and targets, the objective is there, the broad objective is stated, but the target, the specifics of the why, where, when, who's going to do the follow-up, and what time frame is it going to be a follow-up. Many times these are not adequately quantified or the targets are not measurable. It's like, we're going to improve our recycling. Well, when and where and how will you know when you've improved it? You have no benchmark right now. So a lot of focus on objectives and targets when you're looking at EMS auditing. All right. Roles and responsibilities, either not clearly defined or out of date. Organizations are fluid. Certainly any for-profit business is a fluid entity. Organizational charts change frequently. Job descriptions change frequently. It can be a challenge to keep those up to date, but it's important that they are, because the whole issue of roles, responsibilities, and authority is pretty important within the context of an environmental management system. And so many times as auditors we see that some of these things are not quite as up to date. Having said that, because organizations can be sort of a fluid situation with mergers, acquisitions, changing business lines, what have you, changing management team, you many times do find that maybe the latest version of the organizational chart hasn't yet been produced, but this is something that should be addressed. Training needs and requirements are not adequately defined. In other words, who really needs to be trained, not just on the regulatory, environmental regulatory components of your operation, but who needs to be trained for doing internal auditing, and is that clearly defined and kept up to date? And then, as with the whole field of training these days, training and education, we're moving toward more concerns for the effectiveness and the competency of the training and the competency of the individuals conducting, in this case, various operations that may have environmental implications or environmental, impacts. ISO 14001 is not as strong as it could be on this issue of competency, but all the ISO standards and the revisions are moving in that direction. So something to pay attention to and something that external auditors do look at. Okay, next. Document control, either uncontrolled or obsolete documents in circulation. Probably the most common thing is obsolete documents or different revisions of documents. Obviously, for environmental regulatory matters, this will get you in trouble. You don't want two versions of your SPCC plan out there, one in the wastewater treatment plant and one up in the EHS manager's office, and one's current and the other isn't. Same principle with any and all of the documentation that's part and supportive of your environmental management system, something to pay close attention to. Operational control, one of the things we see is the operational control written procedures and signage and all the like might be pretty well covered for rank and file workers, but many times doesn't really include suppliers or contractors, some of which might be on your site for a long-term period. Contract workers are sometimes almost virtual employees, but certainly any other contractors that come onto your site, many of them can have environmental impact, and your operational control procedures should more than adequately oversee that whole component of your operation. Many times that's lacking a bit. All right, next. The monitoring and measurement, certainly in a 14001 context, as it is with quality management, 9001, calibration of equipment, is important. In 9001, you're talking about calibration of production equipment, operational equipment that has to do with the quality of the product or service that you're providing. In an EMS context, it's obviously more about environmental equipment continuous emission monitors, automatic dosing devices at wastewater treatment plants, and so on. Calibration is part of that monitoring and measurement requirement of an EMS, and something that is, if not overlooked, is not really maintained as completely as it could and should be. And then the other issue is that compliance issues, compliance audits, I'm sorry, generally the rule of thumb in practice here in the U.S. is that you expect that a formal regulatory compliance audit has been conducted in the last 3 years. A state inspection or an EPA inspection does not count as an independent compliance audit, or a single focused audit on RCRA or Clean Air Act issues is not a multimedia audit. So oftentimes we come across situations where the compliance auditing is either out of date or was not as complete as it really should be, to assure your organization that you've covered all the bases. Internal audits, oftentimes when they are done, there's a kind of a lack of audit schedule and frequency. Those things should be defined at least on an annual basis. So audits need to be planned, and that means obviously coming up with a schedule and a frequency. Many times this is not as strong a component as it could and should be. Okay? Other common non-conformances, records, certainly the lack of established retention time for environmental records. Many environmental records, obviously, the retention time is established by regulation, by law, but your company may have a different policy in terms of saving it for twice that period, or saving it forever, for the life of the company. Many times we come across situations where there's a lack of understanding of what the retention time really needs to be. It's it's, other than the regulation, it's not dictated to you, but your company or your organization needs to have a clear retention time policy, and you need to show that you're able to follow that. Records that are not retrievable or traceable to specific activities, as with document management, as we've talked about it in the past. All EMS documents don't need to be in the same place, on the same file drive, on the same 3-ring binder, but they do need to be retrievable, and they need to be linked one to another. And many times there can be weaknesses in that regard. And then management review. Oftentimes management review is not adequately documented, and the outputs are not specific. The outputs meaning, all right, management absorbed this information, was reported to management. What happened with that information? What's the outputs of the management review meeting? We'll talk about that, in a moment. All right, next. The time frame for reporting obviously is going to vary between you and the auditee, whether it's an internal audit you're doing, whether you're doing it for an organization, what the purpose is. But generally, you're looking for audit reporting to be conducted, within 3 to 4 weeks after, the audit has been concluded. In registration auditing, ISO registration auditing, most of the work, most of the reporting is done right there on site and can be reported at the closing meeting, at the outbrief. But it may take a couple weeks for a follow-on, formal report. But certainly you shouldn't let it straggle out more than 3 or 4 weeks. Usually, again, it's the responsibility of the lead auditor, unless there's been some other arrangements made. Certainly should cover all the major items of the audit, and you should have covered those or mentioned those at the closing meeting as well, so there are no surprises. Audits shouldn't be about, the auditing process shouldn't be about surprises, both when you're on site and in the reporting phase. Reporting, you many times need to be careful you avoid confidential business information, processes that you've observed that might be covered by patents or other confidentiality agreements, and certainly regulatory information. Again, you're generally, if you're doing an EMS audit, you're not there doing a regulatory compliance audit. You need to be careful in your write-ups that you reflect that. All right, next. Content of the audit reports. These are some things that ISO 19011 helps elaborate on, so I won't dwell on any of these too much. There are different ways of organizing the report, but some are more detailed than not. Some would have the auditor checklist attached. Oftentimes in ISO registration auditing, the auditor notes and the checklists that are used by the audit team are not disclosed to the client. They're kept as part of the work papers of the auditors and the registrar. But if you're doing a more internal audit or auditing one branch is helping another branch or plant, many times that may be the case where these things are appropriate to attach or have as part of the reporting. All right, next. Some of the considerations to think about, certainly not just in the report, but hopefully these have been worked out ahead of time in setting up the audit. When does the clock start on corrective action timeline? Who reviews the draft report, and what can be changed in the draft report? So who's going to get the final copies of it? Suppose you send out the draft report and you don't get responses in a timely manner. How do you sort of, what's your mechanism for kind of closing that time frame and getting the report from the draft to the final stage? And then if it's a facility that you've audited before and there are sort of repeat offenses, very similar to regulatory compliance audit, one of the greatest offenses is to not correct something that was found and have it as a repeat. In the management system sense, it may not be quite as critical in terms of legalities, obviously, but it's still an issue that points out the weaknesses within the management system, the EMS approach, that need to be addressed in one fashion or another. Having worked that out ahead of time and having the report clearly state, whose responsibility is next down the chain can be an important way of having the report not just be a report for the shelf, but actually be an action item where things get done. Next. Follow-up to verify the implementation and the effectiveness of the corrective actions. Let's say you've written some nonconformities and those need to be followed up. A way of evaluating the effectiveness of the management system. So many times in a formal EMS auditing situation, usually the auditee would be following up with reporting on what the corrective actions are and what has been put in place or is going to be put in place to resolve the nonconformities that were found. This is this is just sort of basic basic thinking in terms of making the audit an effective tool for the management system. Who's going to follow up? How you're going to verify the effectiveness? Sometimes you'd have an implementation phase as a follow-on, and you'd have a separate effectiveness phase, so that might be appropriate. It certainly is a lot of times for internal auditing within an organization, not always practical with an external audit team. Okay, next. And then the whole issue of the role of the follow-up is the EMS auditor going to actually provide some of that corrective action assistance, or are they distinct and separate from the audit from the corrective action fixing process, as it were? Certainly, in an ISO registration type of situation, your registration auditors are not allowed to be part of the solution. They're not allowed to tell you how to fix an issue. That's left up to you, the auditee. But a lot of EMS auditing, isn't done for a strict conformance to a standard or a certificate process. It's done really just to look to improve the system and kind of the P2 sense of improvement. And so many times, you're either using a mixture of internal auditors or you're retaining an external auditor that you want to be part of the solution. And if you were with us for part one, we talked about that sliding scale of independence in terms of does an auditor need to be perfectly independent of the operations they're reviewing. In some sense, yes, and other times, no. And the value you might add is that auditors have a good base of knowledge, and they may be involved in helping with those corrective actions. Again, if that's appropriate, if that's been all worked out ahead of time, that can be a very valuable way to go, and certainly acceptable as long as it isn't an after-the-fact thought that it's been sort of designed into the whole auditing corrective action process. All right, next. Sometimes good audits do go bad. There's lots of reasons. And if you have an internal auditing program, an EMS program, and you've had a poor experience, you need to really do some troubleshooting and look at some root cause issues in terms of the audit itself. The audit itself is part of your management system, so treat it like it's part of the management system. Look at the internal audit, the internal EMS audit, as as just another component of your management system, which it is. If it's not going right, is it what's the root cause? Is it training? Is it lack of clarity and purpose? Is it roles and responsibilities? What have you? You want your internal auditing program to be strong and to add value. And so it's important to make sure that you spend the time to do that course correction, to fix what needs to be fixing in your auditing program, to allow it to add value to your management system and your organization. Okay, Ken, I think we have another poll question.
Right. Well, thank you, Dennis. That was very comprehensive. Before we move into our next phase, which will be about management review, we wanted to do another quick poll. So the question is, do you feel your EMS is highly valued by your management team as a tool for continuous improvement? So as you're doing that, go ahead and click. Also, if you do have questions, we went through quite a lot of information through that session. Go ahead and tee those up and put your questions into the chat box, and we'll get Angela ready to review those at the end with Dennis. All right, poll results. So it's kind of a mixed bag here in terms of yes, sometimes, and again, we have a group that's just still coming out online with learning about EMS. And we did get a response here that no. And that might be an interesting area to review as to why that might be happening. So, all right, Dennis, why don't we continue on with the next phase? And again, send your questions in now.
Very good. Well, that's some of those poll results aren't totally surprising because it is a challenge to have any type of management system review, whether it's quality, environmental, health and safety, to get the ear and attention of management, and also to be able to add that value that the management staff, especially the business staff and a for-profit type operation are looking for. So I have a few things to say about management review. It's certainly, if you're doing ISO 14001, whether you're following it or getting certified to it, it's a requirement. The standard talks about sort of periodic reviews, but that generally is interpreted as annual, at least in the U.S. scheme of things. You want top management to be involved. Top management is not specifically defined in the ISO standard on purpose, but it certainly means the plant manager level at an individual facility, or the upper management in any sort of organization, if you're talking about headquarters or a nonprofit. In terms of getting ready for the review, you collect and you disseminate information. You're looking to have decisions made, and then you're looking to have clear outputs from that management review. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So again, as I said, you want to do a management review at least annually, even if you haven't done an audit. Ideally, you have done an internal audit and you have something formally to report to management. But even if you don't, having a review of the organization and the management system on an annual basis is important. It needs to keep in front of people. It needs to be thought of as a living, breathing, active system that you're using day in, day out. You certainly want to have, again, management representatives that have the ability, authority to take action based upon, or delegate action based upon, the findings. You want to do that recording. It can be as simple as taking minutes of the meeting. If your organization already has a formal management review for other purposes, for quality, production, what have you, you're probably used to doing, safety review meetings, environmental compliance review meetings. Many times minutes are kept, and that's adequate record keeping in most EMS terminology. And you sort of want to be looking at any upcoming changes to the organization and to that could affect the EMS. All right, next. So you should be asking, the suitability of the policy. Is there any need for changes? You should be at a management review reviewing the environmental objectives, targets, performance to those targets. Have we met them? Did they need to be reset? All these issues. And then findings from any internal management system and compliance audits that were conducted. Hopefully they have been. But if you're doing management review more frequently, and some organizations do, they do quality and operational reviews monthly or certainly quarterly. And so therefore, there may or may not have been a EMS audit conducted prior to the management review. But if there is, those certainly are things that, and the audit report that we just talked about, are things that you would be making part and parcel of the management review time. Next, please. Obviously, reviewing any specific environmental or health and safety incidents that have occurred. The review should also occur should highlight any changed circumstances in your operations, your products, your services, legislation, regulatory issues, customer requirements, stakeholder complaints or requirements or involvement. Pretty much anything that you would do in a parallel fashion with any quality system. Just here we're obviously focused on environment or environmental health and safety. And you want to look at any review from communication from interested parties, which is kind of the ISO term for things, but in America mostly we also term that group of people stakeholders as a broad category. All right, next. So in a management review, you want to ask, either literally or through the material that you're presenting, did we achieve our objectives? And if not, why not? And what should be done next? Is the policy still relevant? Excuse me. Are we applying our resources properly? Resources are both people's time as well as capital expenditures or whatever perhaps is required. Are we finding ways to fix problems when they occur, when we find them? And there's where a robust internal auditing program helps uncover these things. And do we have a pretty good sort of attitude of prevention in place? And do we have specific programs to help avoid problems in the first place? Many times we focus on corrective actions, a lot more than we do preventive actions. It's kind of human nature, and sometimes there's only so many hours in the day. But the prevention is where kind of the gold is in terms of improving the organization. Next, please. So are we monitoring the EMS? Are there changes in laws that would have us change our approach? Are there been specific stakeholder concerns that have been raised? Maybe stockholders, maybe investor groups, maybe pension holders, maybe neighbors to the facility. Those things should all be taken into account, and the management review time is the best time to really highlight those because they can really be an indicator of how your organization is doing, how it's being viewed by a broader community than just your employees, perhaps. Next, please. Click again. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So this is just a diagram that really sort of emphasizes the outputs to the management review. In the first version of ISO 14001, the 1996 version, it really was kind of silent with regard to management outputs. It was pretty specific with regard to the inputs to a management review, not so much with the outputs. And this was changed in the 2004 revisions. And I think there'll be even more emphasis the next time the standard gets revised. Putting the burden on management. Management has a role to play in any management system. That's the power of it. You can't. Management doesn't get let off the hook. And certainly, if you certify to a standard like 14001, ISO 14001, the external auditors, specifically want to see management's involvement, and you won't get your certificate if there isn't that evidence of strong involvement and direction with the organization. All right, next, please. When we talk about adding value to the management review and how to get having managers' attention, but how to sort of get across the point that this stuff is important. You know, sometimes it helps to kind of get away from some of, especially if we have come up through a technical rank, science and engineering, whatever, or for ISO practitioners, we tend to talk in, you know, ISOEs and use that kind of terminology that our business managers, operational managers perhaps just aren't as familiar with. And so in addition to just the kind of straight audit report and the management system briefing report that you may put together, more and more organizations are looking for different ways of kind of talking the business language. And quality auditors, this is something they wrestle with all the time, of being able to put their findings into a better context of what it means to the organization. So some organizations, some registrars start, you know, using a supplemental report that kind of takes the audit findings and the issues of the management system review and puts them in a little bit more, you know, business language. And here, just sort of a classical kind of SWOT analysis and SWOT report, you know, with some graphics and so on, can get management's attention perhaps more than a cut and dry audit report can. So many times we see that supplementing your kind of standard audit report with kind of a broader approach to putting things in context and putting forward what the implications are for the organization, you know, is critical and can be very helpful. Next slide is fine. Yep. So just a little bit of the road ahead for EMS, because it kind of tells us where things are headed, and not only if you're certified to a standard, but just sort of where the best practices are and what is going to be considered more the norm for having a management system in the future. Three things that I'll just mention here. One is certainly integration into other management systems. Health and safety, environmental health and safety is a common programs that you would integrate, obviously, now in a regulatory sense. But quality programs, ISO 9001, food safety certification of food safety programs, if you're in that sector, or any comparable, you know, industrial sector that has specific standards, telecommunications, and so on. So the integration of these standards is been long talked about in our field, in our practice, but they're really kind of coming to a forefront where companies, organizations can't afford to be running too many silos and not seeing value from the combination and the overlap of these different systems. So big push and big interest in the whole integration just from a systems point of view, if nothing else. As I've kind of preached before, you know, EMS is really, I see it as a driver and an enabler for sustainability initiatives, for preventing sustainability initiatives for just being one-off and just be arm-waving, but actually setting a goal, getting something done, being able to repeat it, being able to evaluate what you've done on the sustainability front. So however your organization defines sustainability, as broadly and as kind of fuzzy a term as that can be, a management system can help get you there and keep you there. And we're seeing more and more evidence of that. And then third is this whole issue of this kind of the business management system. When we're talking about management systems, we're talking about, you know, a business or organizational framework for how you operate, how you do business, how you work each and every day, and how you get things accomplished. The kind of the world and management systems are moving toward this kind of risk. The coming revisions to both ISO 9001 and 14001, probably not out till the year 2015, so a couple years from now, will definitely emphasize kind of the risk management and internal controls approach. So if you have a financial background or financial auditing background, you know the kind of loaded term internal controls. That's kind of what we're looking at for how we view management systems and how they integrate fully into the business or into the organization if you're not a for-profit business. So I think I just have a couple slides here talking about the Audit Roundtable before we take questions. I'll just go through these quickly because we covered some of those under Part 1, but it is a national organization that helps promote best practice auditing standards and as a road to a certification through a sister organization, BIAC. Next, please. There are certification programs, you know, through BIAC, as I said, in management systems, responsible care, compliance auditing, health and safety, and a new one coming along the lines probably by the end of this year on safety process auditing, which is under development. Next, please. The Roundtable is a great professional organization, has many kind of subgroups or interest groups. A couple of the more recent ones, of course, are greenhouse gases, and one that just started up on conflict minerals, something that's going to affect many organizations going forward here. Next, please. And so I just have a couple of slides with regard to contact information. You'll be able to access these slides or get copies of this whole presentation. So next. Next. Just to show you that we've got contact information, and then the last slide. So open to any questions. If anyone has any questions, be glad to address those. Again, you'll be able to get copies of this part 2 as well as part 1, which you already have a link to. And I've covered a lot of material here in this hour and some. So I appreciate that. Hopefully they're still with me, and I've provided some value to you here in thinking about auditing in the context of environmental management system. Again, whether you're certified or whether these are just principles to follow in an EMS as your organization defines it. So any questions?
Thank you, Dennis.
Yes, we have several questions. Does the management review have to be annual, or can it be biannual?
Well, if you're getting certified to ISO 14001, it needs to be annual. The interpretation of most any registrar is going to be that periodic means annual. So by biannual, not every other year. Semi-annual, yes, that would be even better. Quarterly, even better. So more communication with management than less is better. But at the very minimum, the management review for any viable EMS should be at least on an annual basis.
Next question, how do you determine the right size of the audit team for the organization? How long is an on-site periodic audit versus the comprehensive 3-year audit?
All right, a periodic audit, also kind of termed surveillance audit by some registrars. For those of you who aren't totally familiar, in ISO system you have a 3-year contract with the registrar. So the initial audit to get certified generally every 12 months you would have a periodic or surveillance audit. Generally, and at the end of 3 years you would have a re-audit or a recertification audit, called different things by different registrars. Generally, as a rule of thumb, the guidance is that your surveillance or periodic audit would be about 1/3 of the audit mandate effort of your initial registration audit. And then your 3-year recertification audit would be about 2/3 of that level of effort. Certainly there can be things that would change that, and if your organization is fluid and growing, your registrar may think that 1/3 effort for surveillance for periodic assessment is not quite adequate, but that's a pretty decent rule of thumb.
And how do you determine the right size of the audit team for the organization?
Well, if it's a registrar situation, they have auditor day tables that they are obliged to follow. This is for quality auditing, environmental, any types of formal ISO systems, which tells them what the level of effort is appropriate depending upon the size of your organization. That's under the scope of, in this case, an EMS. And the environmental complexity. Are you a low-risk, medium-risk, high-risk organization? And they have sort of a matrix that figures that out. If you're just doing it for your own purposes or for improvement purposes, you certainly have the flexibility to define that. And generally, my rule of thumb, or what I'd like to see, is if you're talking about internal auditing, is the more the merrier. The more people who are cross-trained to be internal auditors or be part of an audit team, the better, because the better the higher chance for a better outcome. And for cross-training people, nothing can sort of beat doing a hands-on audit. It's a great learning experience, and even if the individual is not on every subsequent or future audit, they take something back to their job and their position that helps them better understand why you have a management system, why you're using an EMS, why you're following it, and so on. So there isn't a clear rule of thumb, but it certainly would be, in proportion to the size of your organization and the environmental complexities that you're looking at. Obviously, a warehousing distribution operation is much different than a foundry, for instance, just in terms of environmental issues.
Have you seen EMS implementation and lean manufacturing principles as effective tools that complement each other?
Yes. Lean manufacturing, I believe, was what was asked. Lean
yes.
and 5S and those programs, whether they're followed religiously or whether they're just sort of principles that are sort of woven throughout the organization and adopted sort of as they make sense, they mesh very well with a management system approach. In fact, in the most robust and healthy organization, I would advocate seeing both, because the lean and the 5S thinking is broader than many times than what might be viewed as somewhat confining ISO standards. ISO says do this, do these things, and you'll get your certificate. And sometimes it might be a human tendency to have a little bit of a tunnel vision of doing what's needed and just kind of working to the standard. The principles of lean and 5S and those types of programs, Kaizen, really force you to have a much broader view of process improvement, of organizational improvement, which is really what you're trying to get at when you think about it when all is said and done. So they mesh very well.
And the last question we have right now is, what's the best way to track upcoming changes to ISO 14001?
Well, a very good question. A couple different ways. Certainly, I used to be on the ISO technical committee that formed 14001. I was on for 16 years, but dropped off a couple of years ago just because of just working on too many things at the same time, I guess. So I used to have some firsthand knowledge of what the committee was doing. But now, as more of a layperson, if you would, I keep up by keeping in contact with colleagues who are closer to the situation, but even just monitoring things such as the ASQ, if you're a member of ASQ or organizations such as that, periodically there are articles that will kind of summarize what the latest thinking is with the committees that are developing 14001. And the ISO website itself has a fair bit of public information, even if you're not a committee member. And it's iso.ch. Obviously, it's found headquartered in Geneva, and so CH is the country suffix for Switzerland. So www.iso.ch will get you to there. They're a little bit like the UN. You sort of have to wade through some of the layers to sort of get to some of the information. But there's a lot of good free information there as well. So those kinds of sources, is what I use to kind of monitor and keep an ear to the ground in terms of where things are headed.
And the next question, ISO 14001, has it been replaced or superseded by ISO 19011, second edition, November 15th, 2011?
Well, 14001 has not been replaced. 14001 is the standard for developing, establishing, maintaining an EMS. 19011 is the auditing standard that ISO has developed that applies to quality, environmental, any types of auditing of that sort. Originally, the 1996 version of ISO had three components: ISO 14010, 11, and 12, which did sort of set the parameters for qualifications of auditors, how to set up an audit program. Those were really obsoleted and rolled into ISO 19011. So 19011 was designed to kind of cover all types of management system auditing, and that's why it's sort of become the standard. The other guidelines, especially if you're not certified, are fine. They're good, clear language. There's 14010, 11, and 12. If you have older copies of that, like as I do, they're still worth referring to. They're still good audit principles. But in terms of, in today's day and age, what people look to as the standard for auditing practice and auditor qualifications, it's the November 2011 version of ISO 19011.
And that was our last question.
Dennis, this is Ken Zarker again. Thank you so much for presenting this today. I think you covered a lot of material that we probably could have spent a whole day just on this topic, and all the questions that you put up there within your slides are really helpful for folks to reference back to. And so we wish you well in your work, and thank you for your commitment to the auditing area, and look forward to hearing more developments over the next couple of years as ISO 14001 is continuing to develop. So with that, that concludes our webinar today, and there'll be a short survey after you sign off, and we appreciate your feedback on this as we think about presenting future webinars here for our P2 planners in Washington State. Again, thank you to National Pollution Prevention Roundtable, Angela, for all your help for the series. And everyone take care. We'll talk hopefully real soon. Thank you.